They've been lying to you about the Titanic for over a century. Not intentionally, maybe, but lying nonetheless. Every documentary, every movie, every haunting underwater photograph you've ever seen focuses on one thing: the bow. That majestic front section resting eerily intact on the ocean floor, 12,600 feet below the surface. It's beautiful, it's haunting, it's recognizable. But here's what nobody wants to tell you. That's only half the story. Literally, there's another section down there. A section so destroyed, so utterly obliterated, that most people don't even know it exists. And there's a very specific, very disturbing reason why it looks the way it does. A reason that changes everything we thought we knew about that freezing April night in 1912. September 1985, the world stopped. When those first grainy images of the Titanic shipwreck appeared on television screens across the globe, people were absolutely glued to their sets. After 73 years of mystery, of speculation, of endless theories, we were finally seeing it. The legendary ship, the unsinkable dream, sitting in complete darkness about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. And what we saw was incredible. The bow section looked almost pristine, the railings were still standing, the anchor chains draped across the deck just as they had more than 7 decades earlier. Even the elegant curves of the hull, those sweeping lines you'd recognize from old photographs, were still there. It was like the ship had simply gone to sleep on the ocean floor. But here's where it gets interesting. The news coverage back then barely mentioned the stern. A few passing references, maybe a quick note that yes, they'd found the back section too, but no images, no detailed analysis, no real discussion. And that silence has continued for almost 40 years now. Why? What don't they want us to see? Before I answer that, you need to understand what was at stake when those first images came through. This wasn't just about satisfying curiosity or finding a famous shipwreck. This was about solving one of the greatest maritime mysteries in history. Because for 73 years, there had been a heated debate about what actually happened when Titanic went down. On that terrible night, April 15th, 1,912, more than 1,500 people lost their lives. But here's the thing, about 710 people survived. And among those survivors, testimonies were wildly different. Several passengers swore under oath that they watched the ship break apart as it sank. They describe hearing an enormous cracking sound, seeing the stern rise up separately from the bow, watching the ship literally split in two. But others, equally credible witnesses, said no. They said Titanic went down in one piece, disappearing beneath the waves intact and whole. And here's the kicker. Official investigators believed the second group. The final reports, the ones that went into history books and maritime records, concluded that Titanic had sunk intact. For 73 years, that was the official story. Those survivors who claimed they saw the ship break apart were dismissed, their testimonies questioned, their memories doubted, until we found it. Those 1,985 underwater photographs did more than just locate a famous wreck. They vindicated those witnesses who'd been doubted for 7 decades. Yes, the ship absolutely did break apart as it sank. The evidence was undeniable. The bow was here, and the stern, well, the stern was way over there. About 2,000 feet away, to be exact. 2 massive sections of the same ship, separated by 1/3 of a mile of debris field. So the stern exists, we know where it is, we've sent submersibles down to examine it, we've photographed it, mapped it, studied it, and yet you've probably never seen detailed images of it. You won't find it featured in documentaries the way the bow is. There are no sweeping cinematic shots of the stern section set to melancholy music. Why? Because it's absolutely destroyed. I'm not talking about rusty or damaged. I'm talking about so completely annihilated that it barely looks like it was ever part of a ship. While the bow rests majestically on the seafloor as if it's still on its maiden voyage, the stern is a twisted, mangled, nightmarish tangle of steel. Only the most resilient parts, the massive propellers, the reciprocating engines, the rudder, have managed to maintain any recognizable shape. Everything else has collapsed into itself, melted into the seafloor, becomes something that looks more like an abstract sculpture of destruction than a piece of maritime history. But here's the question that should be keeping you up at night. Why? Why is the bow relatively intact while the stern looks like it went through a car compactor? They sank from the same ship, at the same time, to the same depth, in the same ocean. What could possibly cause such a dramatic difference? The answer is going to disturb you. To understand what happened, we need to go back to that freezing April night. Not to the moment of impact with the iceberg, that's the part everyone knows, but to the final minutes, the moments that determined why half this ship survived the journey down and why half was torn to pieces. Just hours before disaster struck, the stern section was alive. This wasn't the glamorous part of the ship. This wasn't where the wealthy first-class passengers sip champagne in the grand dining room. This was where third-class passengers, the ones who'd paid for the cheapest tickets, spent their time. That's why they were called steerage passengers, because they were housed near the steering mechanism at the back. Families crowded into small cabins, children running through narrow corridors, people sharing communal spaces, hopeful about their journey to America. But the stern wasn't just for passengers. It housed massive storage areas, cargo holds filled with trunks and baggage, industrial kitchens preparing meals for thousands, crew quarters where the ship's workers slept. And crucially, remember this because it's about to become very important, enormous engineering spaces. Boiler rooms, engine rooms, massive compartments that were mostly air. Now, let's jump to when the liner struck that iceberg at 11:40 p.m. The impact tore open the starboard side of the bow and water began flooding in. As the front of the ship filled and started sinking, basic physics took over. The stern began to rise, slowly at first, then more dramatically. By around 20 inches the morning, the ship was at such a severe angle that the strain on the middle became unbearable. The lights flickered, then they went out. And then, with a sound that survivors described as like no noise they'd ever heard before, the ship broke in two. The bow, already mostly flooded, immediately disappeared beneath the waves. But the stern, now separated, briefly settled back down onto the water surface. For a moment, it must have looked almost normal, like maybe it would somehow float. But that moment didn't last. The stern rose again, this time almost completely vertical, pointing straight up into the night sky like a finger reaching for the stars. It stayed like that for a few seconds, a surreal image that survivors would never forget. And then at approximately 2:20 a.m., it began its final plunge. Now, here's where the nightmare begins. Beneath the surface, two completely different scenarios were unfolding. The bow section, because it had been filling with water for over 2 hours, was already saturated. It was heavy, balanced, and it sank in a relatively controlled manner, almost like it was gliding down, settling into the depths. That's why it landed relatively gently and maintained its shape. It was essentially sailing downward like a submarine, pressure equalizing as it went. But the stern? The stern was catastrophically different. When the ship broke apart, the stern section was ripped wide open at the point of the break. Imagine a massive gaping wound, stories tall, where the two halves had separated. And through that opening, water didn't just flow, it exploded inward. The pressure differential was enormous, and water rushed into the stern at incredible, violent speeds. This meant the stern wasn't sinking, it was plummeting, dropping like a stone, tumbling and spinning as it fell through nearly 13,000 feet of water. Remember those engineering spaces I told you to remember? Those massive compartments that were mostly air? That's where the real destruction happened. As the stern plunged downward, spinning and tumbling, the water pressure increased exponentially. And those air pockets trapped inside the stern, they were like bubbles being squeezed in a vise. One by one, they imploded. When air pockets collapse under that kind of pressure, the results are catastrophic. The surrounding structure, the walls, the decks, the supports, they don't just crack, they explode inward. Picture taking an empty aluminum can and crushing it in your hand, except on a scale involving thousands of tons of steel. The stern section essentially crushed itself from the inside out as it fell. The turbulence was so violent that pieces were being ripped off during the descent. Furniture, fixtures, structural elements, personal belongings. They were torn away and scattered across the ocean floor, creating that massive debris field between the two sections. The stern was literally tearing itself apart as it fell, and when it finally hit the ocean floor, it didn't land like the bow. It crashed. It crumpled. It collapsed into itself like a building being demolished. The floors pancaked. The walls buckled. The entire back third of the ship folded in on itself and became the mangled wreckage we see today. That's why we don't talk about the stern, not because it's unimportant, but because there's almost nothing left to see. It's the part of the Titanic story that's too destroyed, too violent, too painful to showcase. While the bow lets us imagine the ship in its glory, the stern forces us to confront the brutal physics of disaster. And if you think that's depressing, I have worse news. The bow isn't going to look recognizable forever either. What you've seen in photographs, that iconic image of the ship at rest on the ocean floor, it's temporary. The Titanic is dying for a second time. Down at that depth, the pressure is almost 390 times greater than at the surface. The good news is there are no more air pockets left to implode. That catastrophe already happened. But the bad news is that the ship's own massive weight, 52,000 tons of steel, is slowly pulling it apart. As the metal settles deeper into the soft sediment of the ocean floor, it twists and warps. Submersible missions have documented large cracks running through steel plates. Decks are beginning to cave in. The structure is slowly collapsing under its own mass. But there's another enemy attacking the wreck, one that's much more insidious. If you've ever seen photographs of the Titanic, you've probably noticed those orange-brown formations hanging from the railings and covering surfaces. They look almost beautiful in a haunting way. Those are called rusticles, and they're not just rust. They're colonies of bacteria and microbes that are actively consuming the ship. These microorganisms feed on iron, and they're incredibly efficient. Scientists estimate that the Titanic is losing between 0.13 and 0.2 tons of iron every single day. That might not sound like much, but it adds up. Year after year, decade after decade, the steel is getting thinner, weaker, more fragile. Researchers have calculated that at this rate, the Titanic could be completely gone within 420 years. By the year 2445, there might be nothing left but a rust stain on the ocean floor and the stories we've told about it. That's why there's such urgency now in documenting everything. Modern expeditions aren't just taking photographs. They're creating detailed 3D scans, high-resolution maps, comprehensive surveys of every remaining detail. Because things are disappearing. That elegant railing where passengers once stood, sections of it have already fallen. The ceiling in the captain's bathroom collapsed. The bridge where officers navigated, deteriorating rapidly. We're in a race against time and nature. Every expedition might be the last chance to capture certain details before they're gone forever. It's our way of preserving the memory, of honoring the 1,500 people who lost their lives, of keeping the story alive even as the physical evidence slowly vanishes into the deep. The Titanic has been resting on the ocean floor for over 110 years now. It survived the initial sinking, half of it anyway. It survived 7 decades of being lost. It survived 40 years of being found, of being visited, of being studied. But it won't survive forever. The ocean that took it that April night is slowly taking it again, piece by piece, molecule by molecule. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe there's something poetic about the ocean reclaiming what sank into its depths. But until that day comes, until the last recognizable piece crumbles away, we'll keep watching, keep documenting, keep telling the story of the ship, the tragedy, and the 2 very different fates of its bow and stern. If this story fascinated you, make sure to hit that like button and share this video with anyone who loves maritime history. There's so much more to explore, so check out the videos on screen for more incredible stories from the depths. And subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into history's greatest mysteries. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.